Welcome to another week of our lessons learned with conversations of our professionals within the security awareness community and those who also help support it. This week, we're really excited to speak with Dr. Alexander Stein, and he is going to be bringing his insights as a psychoanalyst. And Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us. Would you please just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to speak with you and everyone who's tuning in. So I am, as you just mentioned, a licensed psychoanalyst. That's my background, and that's the core of my expertise in the human element. I'm founder of Dulles Advisors, which is a boutique consultancy based here in New York. I'm in my office near Union Square. And the practice areas encompass CEO and executive advisory work, culture, ethics, and governance, working with boards, fraud, corruption, and abuses of power, and cybersecurity and the intersection of humans and technology. And those are all, you could look at them as moons that orbit the centerpiece, which is human decision making. People are at the center of all of those things. And my focus is people who are at the tops of their organization, those in decision making and influence positions, and how all of that plays out in those different realms.
Wow. Well, that's why I'm really excited to have you today in talking about leadership and security awareness managers, and how do we approach leadership? How do we reframe security awareness so that leadership can think of it in its broader sense and its critical role that it plays. So I guess that's kind of first off, how would you go, because we have so many different size organizations. Some are are wearing multiple hats, being the CEO and the CTO and the CISO, but there's others where there's many kind of chains that they have to break through. So I guess we can kind of just start there. How would we, how do you recommend framing security awareness to leadership that, I guess we could break it up, those who are not aware at all and those who have an idea, but they kind of lump it into the governance checklist kind of side of it?
Well, with your permission, let me just take a step back to reframe that frame and and set out my basic perspective and approach on what we're going to be talking about today. So from my perspective, cybersecurity is a human issue that involves technology, not a technology problem that can be solved technically or technocratically. Right. So in the array that you just laid out with all of these disparate levels of knowledge and understanding and functions, you can see the potential for a mess or for some form of disarray or disorganization where rigor is really required. So to look at this, firstly, as a collection of people in a human ecosystem, not as a problem of sort of predators and victims or antagonists and protagonists, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a given. The problem of cybersecurity generally involves people who are doing bad things, but it also involves, negligent insiders as well, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just attackers from the outside. People make mistakes. People are not thinking. All kinds of things are happening. People are working within systems that really have not been designed to truly mitigate certain things happening, and so bad things happen. So how do you go about establishing a really terrific cyber safe culture and cybersecurity program?
The $1 million question.
It's actually more than $1 million, and but here we get to the difference between value and spend. But let's leave the economics aside. Right? We're just going to talk in respect of what are some of the things to think about. Let's take an organization that has been doing phishing tests and really trying to amplify the security awareness level of its workforce, because they're really focused on prevention, and maybe they're a regulated industry, and there's criticality to making sure that assets are kept safe, or that there's sensitive data that needs to be protected. Every organization in its own way has its own reasons for focusing on this. It's very, very important, especially today, where everything is digital. So let's say there's something already in place, some program. There's a CISO who's inherited a program or is trying to enhance the effectiveness of a pre-existing program, or wants to transform it into something superior. There's probably going to be some form of testing taking place, and they're going to take a baseline and see, how are people doing? Are they failing? Are they succeeding? What are the vulnerabilities? What can we do? So recently, the idea of awareness has come into play. For a long time, that actually was not even in the field. And it was, something that people thought about in terms of software patches, or, some other kind of technical maneuver to prevent people from plugging in their USB or some such. So all of those are important. But the relatively recent focus on the human dimension of cybersecurity is an advance, but it's still in its infancy. So there's a lot for people to learn and understand about how complex all of this is. Awareness in itself is too vague, right? So there are essentially three different types of awareness that people should be thinking about. There's content, environment, and self. Content, awareness of content is policies and procedures, security, training, certain things that you need to know about what's going on that's specific to your business or to your industry. Environment, awareness of environment is what are the kinds of things that are particular to the enterprise in which you work, or the area of the enterprise that you're in. People who are working in a call center have a different security environment from people who are in executive management or in the board, right? Self-awareness is perhaps the most complicated and the most nebulous and the least well understood and under-addressed element, but actually the most critical one, which is, who are you? And what are your personal, individual triggers, strengths, and vulnerabilities? In doing awareness training, by and large, I'm going to throw a lot of people into one pot and then throw the pot under the bus. My apologies, but we have brief time. In the main, awareness training usually focuses on issues and externalities, meaning content and environment. They want people to think about certain things. This is what happens, and you should know about that so that when it happens, you don't do what we don't want you to do. That is actually not bad, but it's woefully inadequate.
It's just
really deep, sophisticated awareness enhancement, not just training, means that you have to understand what happens to people when certain things happen. Social engineering, phishing, scamming, the typical techniques that occur, by and large, involve stressor events, pressure. somebody's on the phone, somebody sends you an email and essentially tries to deprive you of or degrade a high-level executive functioning, meaning we don't want you to think about something, we want you to do something, we want you to do it now. And so if people have no idea what happens to them in moments of duress like that, or if they don't really understand what their relationship to pressure or authority is, they're just going to respond on a primitive level, a reflex, right? And
that knee-jerk.
right, so the knee-jerk response. And so there's going to be a significant gap between the design of the program, which may look great and have buy-in from everyone in the C-suite and the board, and how it actually plays out, because the people are not conforming to the design. And so that gap is where I do my work. Trying to bridge those things to help organizations understand what's actually happening inside the individuals who need to be able to or are expected to perform differently, to change their behavior. So I can go on and on and on. I'm going to pause. Maybe there's some questions from the audience, or you have a question, or we can take it in a different direction, as you wish.
Yeah. So actually, so you say you're here to bridge the that gap, and part of that also is the leadership themselves being aware, having that own self-awareness, which I think first off is just fascinating, that you pointed that out and brought that out, because as I've gone through my own journey of learning about cybersecurity and learning how to be more aware, I realized it's like it does cause it does require one person to be aware of oneself, exactly as you say, to know when you're getting triggered, when those little flags are going off, to say, oh, I need to pay attention to that flag, hold on a moment. And in so many different circumstances, having that digital situational awareness was really eye-opening for myself, to realize, how if we don't have that self-awareness, we really are setting ourselves up to be more susceptible. But that's not an easy conversation you can just go have with your C-suite and say, oh, by the way, we need to all, take this self-awareness training, and kind of a delicate process because people are complex. How do you go about even opening that conversation with leadership?
Yeah, you've just named one of the most challenging aspects in cybersecurity, which is kind of a variation on the theme of the insider threat, which is the tendency to be defensive or closed-minded around certain things that might have some stigma attached to it, or make people feel vulnerable because they're saying, this is something that I don't know, or I don't understand, or it's not in my control, or it's not tangible, or some such. So oftentimes starting that conversation requires a particular orientation from a mindset from leadership that this is valuable. And it shouldn't be peripheralized. It shouldn't be considered esoteric or dismissible.
Right.
So I typically look at this as, I can come into an organization with a whiteboard, or I can get called in with a mop and a pail. And often it's the latter, because it does seem, unfortunately, to be human nature to ignore certain things until you can't ignore it anymore. And so, a crisis is typically what catalyzes attention to be paid to problems. And then the reflex there is, let's fix the problem and not do a root cause analysis of what gave rise to the original problem, which means that there's going to be a cycle to that crisis, right? So you've passed the initial one, and sort of recovered, but there's probably going to be a recurrence.
That was
So,
exactly what I was going to ask you, is when are you brought in usually, with companies with, that are a little more forward thinking per se, but typically you still see the same mop and pail scenario more often than the proactive. Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully that will change. I do what I can to try to make that change, but invariably something needs to trigger the thinking, not just the forward thinking of this is really important and let's do something about it. And let's address it in a non-conventional way. Like, let's look at what else is going on.
Right.
And not every leader is oriented to think that way, or not every board is willing to take that on. It depends on kind of progressivism or conservatism with regard to various kinds of risks, and people have different risk, and different organizations have different risk appetites and tolerances for such things, which includes steps taken to mitigate risks. Right? Bruce Schneier, the famous security guru, has a wonderful and very insightful comment on this. He talks about security as being made of two things, right? It's a feeling and a reality. You can feel secure but not be secure, or you can be secure but not feel it. And it's just a wonderful way of looking at the whole range of issues at play in organizational decision making around its understanding of what the problem sets actually are, and thus what the appropriate addresses are for those problems.
I wonder, most security awareness managers, there's no one set role, right, that defines a security awareness manager. It might be the IT guy, it might be the CISO, it might be, the governance, department. And it requires so much of a broad range of skills, really, because you've got to be this communicator, you've got to work with HR, very interdepartmental, cross-cultural, making sure you're using the right language. It requires a lot. Is there a tool or perspective you might recommend for those who are not, who may not have the soft skills naturally, but they've been given this job, and maybe to help them even think of how to, even perhaps look at it in helping them shift their own perspective to also shift, eventually, and working towards on those higher ups that they might need to influence as well?
Yeah. So first of all, recognizing that you may not possess, the full complement of necessary soft skills should be treated as any other self-assessment in your professional role, and hopefully people who are committed to professional development will want to do something about that. And so, there should be some focus on, learning and acquiring some of those competencies. Another perspective, which is also important, is to remember that great leadership doesn't necessarily entail doing everything yourself. It also involves understanding how to build a great team. And so, if there are things that you're not so good at, but are actually really important to fulfill the capabilities or the functions that are within your brief of work, get those people around you and consult with them. One of the other things that's still evolving and very important is having the information security function elevated to the executive level. The fact that in many organizations, the CISO may not actually be considered a part of the C-suite is already, I would say, an internal vulnerability for the organization. That because it's just that's such a crucial position, and not just in itself, but also because you want to be able to articulate and harmonize all of the different functions. So, the idea that one individual actually should be able to be some kind of super person who knows everything that needs to be known and can do everything is ludicrous. So, in real respects, high quality cybersecurity, but really more than cybersecurity, is a harmonization and collaboration between and among many different functions and stakeholders in an organization. And there needs to be cross-functional communication between among all of them all the time, not just when you're testing something or when you're on the verge of a disaster or just after and you're doing the cleanup.
Right.
So, because it involves risk and regulatory and compliance and legal and HR and governance and technology, and there's almost nothing actually that isn't in some way implicated and certainly touched by all of these things in a very intertwining way.
Right, it definitely is. I think one of the I guess recurring themes I hear a lot from the professionals I listen to are just that the need in trying to encourage businesses to, let's just have a tabletop, let's just bring all stakeholders all together and really discuss and understand better how these things are connecting and touching both ways, and having that two-way conversation. I think that is very critical. So if you were to come in with your whiteboard to an organization, right, in the ideal situation, obviously it's very generalized, but what are some of the kind of the main points that you try to hit in trying to bridge that gap between the checklist and the technical stuff to the self-awareness for an organization overall?
My fundamental starting point for almost everything is diagnosis. I want to understand what is the state of the organization now,
Mm-hmm.
and why is it here? In many regards, if you're looking at human decision making and all of the ways that it influences the actions that occur, you need to understand its history. So you have to understand where things have come from to know why they are where they are now.
Right.
So there's some form of assessment that I will always want to do with regard to, what do you think is working well? And what are you challenged by? Or, what's the last worst thing that happened? And what is your understanding of why that happened? And what do you think needs to be done to fix it? And let's talk about that and see what that's actually made of, right? Let's do a forensic on those kinds of things. Because you can't really build truly wonderful, which is to say robust, sustainable solutions for things, which includes not just solving a problem, but like mitigating potential problems, unless you really understand what the problem is or what the problem sets are, and can look at all of the different component elements of it. It's not just one thing or another thing. Everything is connected, and it's more spherical than flat. It's multidimensional. It's multifunctional, and so part of the initial work is taking everything and just kind of laying it out almost as if it were a puzzle that's been disassembled, and seeing all of the pieces of it.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like a lot of, having just this initial assessment of kind of seeing where are we, where's our baseline at, and how did we get here? What's the story up to this point? Where do we want to be? And kind of assessing that. So the human element, how do you tie that into it? Once you kind of assessed, technically, where some of the weak points are, where some of the strengths are. Then what do you look at?
It depends on what the focal areas are intended to be. So, for example, when I've been brought in to design or enhance some form of awareness program, you need to have an as-is assessment of awareness. And so there has to be some form of methodology that's deployed into the organization, an instrument of some sort that determines where are people now. It's kind of like going to the doctor and getting your vitals taken. What's going on? All right, so you want to take the temperature and the pulse of people's understanding and knowledge, and what are they good at and not. I always like to probe as deeply as possible into those sorts of things. So, as one example, as a general proposition, for example, in phishing tests and things like those, organizations usually have a binary approach, meaning, you got this right or you got it wrong, but there isn't terribly much inquiry into why. So I'm always interested in the why of pretty much everything, because that also really matters. The fact that somebody got something right or something wrong tells you something, but not enough to really be able to make a robust determination around, well, what else needs to be done or not done to fortify that.
So when you're looking at the why, how is that something, because part of the question we have a lot of times is how do you scale it, right? Especially for larger organizations. So you can't necessarily go to each individual person and ask them why did you click this link this time? So is there a way to kind of broadly assess that?
So let me push back on that and suggest that you actually can. It may not be one conversation. If you have a workforce that's global or you have thousands of employees, indeed, one-on-one conversations is going to be overly cumbersome. However, there are instruments that involve why questions, and so if you have some form of capacity to harvest narrative responses, then you ask people, well, what were you thinking about, or what was going on? Were you distracted? What else was happening? And there are ways of determining with some reasonable precision, what was going on for any particular person, even if it's anonymous. And so then you have a much richer data set around what people are actually doing or not doing, because there are just so many different kinds of variables. And another thing that's critical to understand here is awareness is not a behavior, right? So there is psychologically a difference between understanding something and doing something different. Lots of people know what's right and wrong. Lots of people understand what they should and shouldn't do, but they do those things anyway. Peter Cook, the wonderful British comic actor, who was, his heyday was in the 60s and 70s, I think, has this great saying, I've learned from all of my mistakes and I can repeat them perfectly. And that's pretty much the human condition right there. So people, part of the process is building a bridge that connects the cognitive component with the behavioral component. The idea that many organizations have, that all you have to do is enhance awareness and the behavior will change, is a cardinal misnomer that handicaps the project before it leaves the door.
Right. In a previous conversation recently, it was pointing out, the importance of having a feedback loop as close to the time of incident as possible that is, educational and set, first off, seeing what, like you're saying, find out more qualitative information of why they clicked, or, and then, finding out, what was going on. I that makes a lot of sense. Trying to create those opportunities to get that information at the time of the incident, so that it's much more memorable, right? If we have the incident along with the solution or the explanation to even just understand, the importance of why that was or should not have clicked, or why I messed up that time but not in last time.
Right.
Yeah, that's very, very critical for sure. Well, that actually, the time went actually really fast.
We've barely gotten started.
I know we did. We just got started. But you have any insights, like just maybe a takeaway that you would, either resources you would point people towards for them to kind of go and maybe to do a little bit more learning, or to consider, tools to implement that might be useful. Just some takeaways for them that you would recommend.
Well, at the risk of being blatantly self-promoting, I am a resource and would be delighted to entertain inquiries and questions about this from anyone. My website is dolusadvisors.com. You can email me. There's also a library on the website that has articles and interviews and some videos, including a panel that I was on from Wizer with Gabby Friedlander as host, which people can access. And really the main resource that I would encourage business leaders to use is thinking for themselves about what is it that they really think they need, and not just go out into the marketplace and buy a product or engage a consulting service because they have blinky lights and shiny things and
Yeah.
really sweet looking PDFs or whatever, because off the shelf products may have their place in the world, but everything has to be customized ultimately.
Right.
Every organization has its own distinct features and its own culture and its own challenges, and you can't just buy a generic product and think it's going to solve your problems.
Right. No, definitely. I think that's a really big challenge still. Conversation that keeps happening over and over. But and it's something interesting you see across different industries, right? We'll just solve it and buy more tech without learning really how to use the tech we have, and the people we have, and train the people. So that's definitely good note to end on. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining us this week, and we will write a recap up also and include the resources on the recap as well. And we look forward to continuing to learn from you, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you. Bye.